Hey guys, Mr. Klein here, and I'm at Battery Cooper, one of the many coastal defenses built to defend Pensacola, Florida. However, despite these formidable emplacements behind me, they were all useless in one of the lesser-known areas of conflict in World War II. So throughout 1942, German U-boats cut a swathe of destruction through the Gulf of Mexico in Nazi Germany's attempt to stop the flow of supplies to Europe during the War of the Atlantic. So in this video, we're going to explore the U-boat campaign in the Gulf and how the U.S. Navy utilized Louisiana in an attempt to stop them. So let's go ahead and let's get started. World War II was not the first time German U-boats were unleashed on commercial ships. World War I gave a taste of what was to come when the Imperial German Navy's U-boats nearly brought Great Britain to its knees during unrestricted warfare in the years of 1916 and 1917. However, convoy operations by the Allies, as well as a concerted campaign to attack U-boats, eventually turned the tide against the German Navy. And in the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I, the German Navy was actually banned from having any sort of submarines or even having the technology in place in order to build them. So as you could guess from the introduction, the Germans did build U-boats again, and at the outbreak of the Second World War, the Navy, or the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm, again sought to deny the United Kingdom the ability to resupply itself and continue the war effort. Convoy operations by the Allies began almost immediately, and while U-boats were relatively ineffective in the opening months of the war, two events radically transformed the course of the battle. So the first was that the Germans conquered France in May to June of 1940, and in the process built massive submarine pens on 5 locations on the Atlantic coast of France. So what this did is it enabled U-boats direct access to the Atlantic without having to pass around the United Kingdom and the Royal Navy's anti-submarine forces. So the second was a change of tactics by the U-boats to the famous Wolfpack tactics you might have heard of. Rather than sail individually, German U-boats would sail in loose groups of 6 to as large as 30, where a convoy was suspected to pass through. So once the convoy was sighted by a U-boat picket or by a Luftwaffe patrol plane, the pack would then close in and attack the convoy. So this was effective throughout 1940 and into 1941, which was known as the Happy Time by German submariners. Throughout 1941, though, the Royal Navy and Kriegsmarine moved the battle into the open Atlantic Ocean as the cat-and-mouse game between the two sides continued. So the Allies began introducing new technologies such as radio direction finding to detect U-boat communications, improvements in sonar known as ASDIC by the British, and the breaking of the Germans' Enigma codes to stem these losses. However, a surge in operational U-boats increased the tonnage sunk. The United States was slowly entering the fray through the Lend-Lease Act, which gave the Royal Navy 50 old destroyers for anti-submarine duties and began actively patrolling the Western Atlantic in what were called neutrality patrols, which led to confrontations between the United States Navy and German U-boats before there was actually a declaration of war. The most notable of these confrontations was when U-552 sank the U.S. destroyer Reuben James in October of 1941. So after Pearl Harbor and Hitler's subsequent declaration of war against the United States, the Battle of the Atlantic extended to the entire Atlantic Ocean, as well as the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So the head of the Nazi U-boat arm, Admiral Karl Dönitz, saw the opportunity to sink large numbers of ships at their source in the United States. With the eastern seaboard defended by a tiny number of ships ill-equipped to deal with battle-hardened U-boat crews, losses along American shores piled up throughout January and February of 1942 through what the Germans called Operation Palkenschlag, or drumbeat. Buoyed by this initial success, Dönitz ordered boats to begin operations in the Gulf of Mexico. 24 U-boats operated in the Gulf of Mexico in all, with 6 being the most there at any one time of May of 1942. So many of these boats were the Type 9C U-boats, which you can actually see one at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The U-boats were based in the submarine pens of Western France and went on patrols of up to 5 months in the Caribbean and the Gulf. So while these boats were long-range, the transatlantic travel to the operational area in the Gulf ate into their fuel stores and supplies. The Germans utilized submarines converted into tenders, which they nicknamed Milchkühe, or milk cows, to refuel the U-boats and also top off their fresh food supplies, safe from Allied attack and before they continued their war patrol. Now initially, U-boats entered the Gulf through the Straits of Florida, but once anti-submarine patrols began off of Key West, they came in between Cuba and Mexico. So while U-boats could travel submerged under battery power, their maximum underwater speed was only 4 knots, which was the same speed as the current flowing out the straits, making underwater transit almost impossible. Unlike the open Atlantic, there were no wolf packs in the Gulf. So what U-boats did is they individually patrolled in mainly 3 areas where shipping was the heaviest. So the first was from Key West to Tampa in Florida, the waters between Galveston and Port Arthur, Texas, and off southeast Louisiana between Morgan City and the mouth of the Mississippi River. So Texas and Louisiana received close attention due to the high volume of traffic, especially oil tankers headed to the northeast states in the days before cross-country pipelines, and freighter traffic coming into and departing New Orleans, which was an extremely important port at the time. So just like the rest of the Operation Drumbeat crews, U-boats in the Gulf were shocked by the ease which they found targets. Cargo ships sailed as though it was peacetime, with lights aglow and ignoring the effectiveness of convoys against submarine warfare. Oil from sunken tankers burning in the night became a common occurrence as U-boats sank 22 ships totaling 122,857 tons in May of 1942, the most of any month in any area during the entire Battle of the Atlantic in the war. The Gulf Sea Frontier, the naval command in charge of operations in the Gulf, was caught completely flat-footed and scrambled to counter the U-boat menace. Orders were given for ships to sail in convoys with their lights off, escorted if possible by sub-chasers built in Gulf shipyards like in Orange, Texas. Civilian boats were pressed into service to report sightings of submarines and from picking up survivors from U-boat attacks. According to U.S. records, the total number of naval and Coast Guard ships in the northern Gulf of Mexico at the outbreak of war was pitiful. So there were 3 armed merchantmen, 3 yard boats, 1 patrol craft, and 4 active class Coast Guard cutters. In terms of air power, there were 6 Coast Guard observation planes. None of them were armed. So in response, the U.S. Navy beefed up the defenses of the Louisiana coast, especially since the coastline was marshland and largely unpopulated. So there were fears that U-boats would sail into the inlets for protection and perhaps even support from Nazi sympathizers in the state. Naval operations were centered on the section base at Burwood in the Mississippi River Delta, where patrol boats were based, and along with the facility at South Pass, shipping in and out of the Mississippi River was controlled. So unlike modern submarines, World War II submarines all carried deck guns for use when engaging ships on the surface. So there were fears that U-boats would attempt the Shell Port facility, so the U.S. Army Coastal Defense Command built and manned 3 artillery batteries for protection in Louisiana. So 2 of these installations were in the Birdfoot Delta. 1 battery was protecting Burwood and the other one Port Eads. The other installation was south of Cameron at Calcasieu Pass to protect the refineries there. All 3 installations consisted of 155mm field artillery pieces that sat on concrete pedestals like the one standing behind me in Pensacola. So each battery consisted of 2 guns, and none of these guns were ever fired in anger, and they were all abandoned after the war, and in fact in the state of Louisiana you can't even see them. U.S. anti-submarine tactics relied on aircraft and surface ships working in combination to find and attack U-boats. In fact, many of the commercial airports in South Louisiana, like this one here in Lafayette, were originally military air bases. U.S. Navy and Coast Guard observation planes were based at the Naval Air Station in New Orleans, and Army Air Force planes were available for operations in New Orleans and Lake Charles. On anti-submarine missions, they would fly alongside convoys along the shipping routes near the coast and out into the Gulf. In addition, they performed search and rescue operations over sunken ships. However, aircraft like the Grumman Duck and Widgeon and the Hall PH were relatively short range, meaning that their time on station was short because of the distances between the air bases and the Gulf. The U.S. Navy sought to increase the amount of time aircraft covered convoys and the time that they could spend on anti-submarine patrols. They came up with a really unique solution: blimps. So because blimps are lighter than air, they could stay aloft for longer than any other aircraft, and their slow speed meant that it was really easier for them to stay with the convoy because they didn't have to fly around in circles. The U.S. Navy built 2 naval air stations for blimp operations. One was in Hitchcock, Texas near Galveston, and the other in Louisiana in Houma. NAS Houma opened in May of 1943 and had 4 operational blimps which had the capacity to stay aloft for 24 hours on a mission, far beyond the capability of a regular airplane. The blimps were stored in a gigantic hangar, which was at the time the world's largest wooden structure. NAS Houma was closed in 1947 and is today the Houma Terrebonne Airport. All that remains of the hangar are the concrete foundations, and when you look on aerial photographs of the former base, you can still see signs that the base are still existent today. Even with all these military assets present, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard were stretched really thin and needed extra eyes for observation, as well as helping in recovering crews from sunken ships. So civilian auxiliaries working with both the Civil Air Patrol and the Coast Guard provided invaluable manpower and expertise to counter the U-boat threat. So the Civil Air Patrol launched reconnaissance missions initially at the New Orleans Lakefront Airport, but later moved to an oyster shell landing strip on the beach in Grand Isle where they could better perform missions covering the shipping lanes from the Mississippi Delta to Marsh Island. Civilian fishermen assisted mainly in search and rescue and picking up survivors from U-boat attacks and returning them to shore, but were also encouraged to report any suspicious activity to authorities. Ashore, there was the Coastal Observer System, which volunteers were trained in basic intelligence gathering, including looking for suspicious activity, suspicious lights or radio interference, and monitoring people in their own communities on the lookouts for spies or Nazi sympathizers. So despite their training, observers turned in the information to the government, which after investigation proved to be either bad or completely irrelevant, as German records showed that absolutely no U-boats went into coastal inlets, nor were there any German agents landed in Louisiana throughout the entire war. Despite the massive success of U-boats throughout May and July of 1942, that proved to be the end of the happy time for the U-boats in the Gulf. Karl Dönitz ordered U-boats to return to the North Atlantic for Wolfpack operations against the huge Allied convoys, and U-boats vanished from the Gulf waters. So at the beginning of 1943, there was a brief return to the Gulf, but the success was minimal, with only about 4 ships sunk over the course of the entire year, as U-boats prowled the waters one at a time. So the combination of massively increased air and sea patrols, convoying of ships, and most importantly, the reduction of oil tankers in the northern Gulf due to the opening of oil pipelines between Texas and the Northeast, made operations pointless, considering the resources involved. So the last ship sunk in the Gulf during the U-boat patrols in the Gulf was when U-193 sank the Touchet, an oil tanker on its very first voyage, sunk in the southeastern Gulf on December 3rd, 1943. So there you go, a history of the U-boat campaign in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, while the focus of this video was on Louisiana, many of the same defenses and strategies described were used all along the Gulf Coast. So from Brownsville, Texas to Dry Tortugas, Florida, and everywhere in between, sub-chasers, aircraft, and civilian craft of all types worked together to prevent shipping losses. And while they did eventually succeed in this regard, U-boats escaped relatively unharmed in the Gulf. Only a single sub was lost, U-166, and it was sunk off the mouth of the Mississippi River. So in the second episode of this series, we're going to look at the events that led to the sinking of U-166, the 60-year search for its final resting place, and the heroism of a crew finally receiving their due after being almost forgotten by history. I'll see you then.